The American order, a US fantasy or a reality gone wrong? It is a reality, except that in creating more disorder than order, it has likened itself more to fantasy. Too many nations have either fallen slave to the will of the US or are suffering severe consequences for not taking an unequal deal. And now those nations are on a path to break the US hegemony altogether. Iran is one such nation that has taken the helm. The New World Order was to be one of great power cooperation in the post-Cold War era. At least that's how former Russian and US Presidents Mikhail Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush had envisaged it. But with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there wasn't much of an Eastern Front left to join forces with the US, which was to become the sole and uncontrollable superpower of the world. Or is it? Stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today for the answer and more. With a population of under 330 million, the US is struggling to administer itself, albeit with Donald Trump at the fore. Now, how can the US shepherd a world population of around 8 billion? It has tried by putting punishment before reward and force before friendship, but in imposing some form of sanctions on 3 major eastern states, it has only pushed them closer together. The result? A new Eastern Bloc is arising, a front to America. That is an alliance between Iran, Russia, and China. Perhaps the US best adopt a new strategy, a diplomatic one, in engaging with countries such as Iran, countries insisting on independence and running their own sovereign affairs. I've come to Parliament to see what MPs have to say on the US way, Iranian resistance, and the pros and cons of it all.
We
believe that these nations have to find one another. They can now form a pole. The US is not in a position to dictate its words on other nations. If these nations close ranks, they will be able to fill each other's needs and deliver a united, strong and effective blow to the Americans. If some countries are following in the US footsteps, like South Korea, that has seized billions of dollars of our assets in compliance with the US sanctions, we would not have to have normal ties with them. A country moving in the direction of US interests is no different from the Americans themselves. That is part of the US scheme against us. The friend of our enemy is definitely our enemy, as they are showing hostility.
The main issue is that we need to let countries such as Venezuela know that they can come and join us. There are numerous countries which are way more powerful than Venezuela and yet don't have the guts to stand in the face of US's excessive demands. To Iran, gaining profit by simply selling oil is not as important as proving the fact that Venezuela's energy sector can be activated despite US's disagreement.
Our foreign ministry, instead of sitting with a group of bullying powers without achieving anything in the end, should hold talks with the impoverished nations. Talking with these poor nations would earn us profits, so that we can sell them oil or have transactions with them.
The threesome alliance of the East is more complicated than to have been caused by a single Western factor, however. Iran is working to fortify the alliance by trying to realize long-term contracts with China and Russia. But what both parties are also eager for must yet surmount regenerative US hurdles before fully materializing. What is more simple in that it has emerged predominantly because of US sanctions is partnerships between boycotted states such as Iran and Venezuela. But the US has not taken that lightly.
Due to US's hegemony, there would be no interaction. As our late Imam said, it's like the relationship between wolf and sheep. So the objective is not any third world growth, Rather, the US is seeking to devour the third world more than ever. This is the continuation of a colonialism that has existed. Devouring some nations like Iran, however, is not just easy, rather it's impossible. It will never come true.
In other words, there's no room for independent states in the new American world order. To impose its new world order, the US set out on a quest to 1. Impose puppet governments on other countries in the name of bringing democracy to them, and 2. To retain the dollar as the world's reserve currency. In doing so, it has left in its wake a trail of war-stricken and failed states and boycotted states.
The Americans claim to pursue the policy of global village or so-called New Order. They say that the world has become like a village due to extended communications. In such village, the Americans claim that they are masters and all other nations are like slaves. That is the founding element of barbarian West and the US. They always look down upon other countries, including their own European allies. A number of nations refuse to recognize the US-imposed order, thereby opposing US bullying and injustice. Since they refuse to accept US bullying, they are slapped with US sanctions. The leading country in this ground is the Islamic Republic of Iran that refuses to bow to US bullying.
Just recall the lengthy, costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the interventions in Syria and Libya, among others. They have not affected only the named countries, but the entire global economy. Also, US sanctions are posing a serious threat to nuclear non-proliferation. More on that later. A go-to interviewee of ours for all matters Latin American is a Hispan TV editor-in-chief, Mr. Zulfaqari.
Under all US administrations, their politicians have sought to dominate the country's rich in natural resources, which they would need to feed their big industries. Our energy-rich region has been a target of US domineering approach. The Americans maintain their presence in the region even after invading Afghanistan to remove the Taliban and invading Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. This time they claim to be fighting Takfiri groups. They caused chaos in Syria, the Yemen war broke out. The war on Yemen was launched by Saudi Arabia, which is the US's closest ally in the Persian Gulf.
But doing whatever it takes hasn't made the world a safer place for Americans either. Still, the US deliberately pursues a path of warmongering that necessitates its support for terror groups potentially dangerous also to Americans. Terror groups such as Daesh or ISIS.
The Americans are taking advantage of ongoing imbroglio in regional nations despite apparently suffering costs. The US president has acknowledged that his country has invested $7 trillion but gained nothing in return. In fact, that is not so. Major arms deals have been signed with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar and other regional nations. The arms manufacturing companies in the US and some of its allies, including France and Britain, are gaining major profits from the arms deals.
Globalization, literally meaning strengthens global connections and interdependence, has benefited non-Western nations, but with the downside of containing them. Bound by international capital, countries and individuals alike are exposed to unprecedented risks. Those risks are namely extreme imbalance in distribution of the benefits and rendering individuals helpless before the control of international capital, thus far the dollar. China, with its powerful economy, is a magnet for international trade. Now, with more nations bringing their business to China and the new Eastern Bloc of sorts, a good volume of international trade can be conducted in local currencies of the states in direct business with one another. This would cut the dollar out of those transactions and render parties independent of Western banks.
Each country pursues its own interests, but the question is that we have to minimize our losses and maximize our interests in our ties with other countries. During a specific period of time, we might have benefited more than now from dealing with China, but under those circumstances, we are looking at the superpower only.
Iran and Venezuela, both major members of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, were banned from exporting oil by the US. A severe gas shortage ensued in Venezuela, and Iran had the gas and means to transport it to the Latin American state, and it did so in spite of US threats. Between late May and early June, it dispatched 5 gasoline tankers. The 60 million-ton flotilla sailed across the Caribbean to get over 1.5 million barrels of gasoline and alkylates safely to Venezuelan shores. Iran has also helped get Venezuela's major refinery back to work partially. Another ship was also dispatched from Iran to Venezuela with food in June, most of it for the new Iranian supermarket in Venezuela called Megasis. The supermarket is another means of mutual benefit, as it will boost the production and exports of Iranian commodities. Iran's ambassador to Caracas described the opening of the store as a move to counter the US policy of economic terrorism and support the Venezuelan nation at the time of heightened sanctions. Food and fuel are to be continually incoming goods to Venezuela.
بحث سوپرمارکت شاید بگم یک سوپرمارکت چه اهمیتی میتونه داشته باشه.
Iran's inauguration of a supermarket in Venezuela may be underestimated. That was a first step in the direction of supplying Venezuelans' needs. Like us, they are under tough sanctions. However, what makes us different from Venezuela is that we are in good conditions in terms of production. We can supply our own vital needs, but Venezuela is in no position to do so now. Venezuela naturally needs support and help. The Defense Ministry opened the first branch of a chain store there.
Iran is expected to dispatch 2 or 3 monthly shipments of gasoline to Venezuela. This would help offload the gasoline inventory that Iran accumulates, as well as alleviate the fuel shortage in Venezuela. Also importantly, it would be defying US bullying, call it hegemony. How likely is it for other boycotted states to join this trade mechanism between Iran and like countries, the secondary market, so to speak?
قطعاً یه الگوسازی شده، یعنی الان این گونه نیست.
We cannot say that Iran is a totally isolated nation. Other countries are seeking Iran and always refer to it. Even at the UN Security Council, the former president Indonesia and the current president Niger expressly opposed the US's attempt for sanctions snapback against Iran. That is a positive point. At an international body, the US demand was rejected and other efforts have been fruitful.
Iran and other independent states suffering the toughest US sanctions due to their independence have begun a process of direct trade in money and in kind among themselves. How efficient and successful is their method? Mr. Goudarzi is an Iran-Venezuela relations analyst. Here's what he had to say.
So they decided to start a very smart movement in the last few months, which is just exchange of the products and the articles that they need. It's like gas, oil, or aluminium and some other kind of products. So that is just avoiding the US sanctions, and it has a great message and a big message to US administration, which is that US is really weak nowadays, and they can't unite all other countries against these two countries that are avoiding its sanctions. So this can become a model to follow for other countries.
But although Iran-Venezuela transactions are based on bilateral needs and fully legal, the US has openly threatened to sabotage and react whenever it can. That cannot be legal by international norms. However, going against norms is normal to the US. Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif said, "Unfortunately, a law-breaking country, the United States, seeks to punish a country, Iran, that is abiding by law. This method will have severe consequences for the world order." I got to talk to some passers-by to hear their thoughts.
Iran's extensive communication across the world would defeat the US bullying tactics and the Iranian economy will improve.
Venezuela is under heavy sanctions. I don't know if they are imposed by the UN or the US, or they are the result of their internal problems. Iran recently sent them 5 cargoes of gasoline. Iran has recently opened a supermarket there and has been helping them. These ties are good.
The US has long lost its credit among Iranian nation. If in the past there were some groups in Iran which believed that we should sit and talk with the US or we should trust this country, but today all Iranians have come to the understanding that the US government is not trustworthy. Iran, Venezuela and other countries should have stopped pinning all their hopes on the US government.
Time for a quick break with Shahrzad for a look at other media outlets.
Hi, my name is Shahrzad Manucheri, and this week we'll be reviewing the latest update on the country's bilateral ties amid US sanctions and debunking the American world order. The Interpreter claims the vanishing hegemon. In recent weeks, Western critics have penned multiple obituaries for the world we have known since 1945. Globalization, some have argued, has passed its tipping point. Liberalism is a spent force, democracy all the more so. The sheer impotence of international institutions has been exposed. China has fully arrived. And the United States, now the epicenter of virus outbreaks, has proved itself unwilling and incapable of coordinating any kind of global response, a confirmation of its deteriorating capacities both at home and abroad. The corona crisis, so runs this view, has accelerated the advent of a world that is at once terrifyingly novel and uncannily familiar. Novel because it's multipolar and uncertain, but familiar because it seems to play on old motives of nations, big states, borders, self-sufficiency, and paranoia about outsiders. In an article by The Hill, we see, is America the defender of sovereignty? Washington can reduce its reputation as a threat to the sovereignty of weaker powers. This can be done at no additional cost to the US defense. This means dropping interventionist rhetoric and instead emphasizing the right of smaller states to determine their destinies. Throughout the Vietnam War, the most common refrain of those opposed to withdrawal was that it would undermine the US alliances around the world, empower a triumphalist Soviet bloc, and expand Chinese influence. The collapse of American-aligned South Vietnam and Cambodia immediately after US withdrawal was taken as only the first stage of this dire prediction coming true. Compare this to the situation in the Middle East since the US invasions of Iraq, Libya, and via proxies attempt to topple the government in Syria. While there are distinct power poles in the region, Washington's sway with Turkey is constantly decreasing. Iran is placed on a permanent enemies list, driving it toward China and Russia out of necessity, and Egypt is a bit of a wild card as it forges a new foreign policy focus. Valdai Club uncovers the cacophony of powers. The most important factor shaping interstate relations today is the relative decline of American power. The trend is commonly attributed to the rise of other states, first and foremost China, yet it has an arguably more important domestic origin, as the US foreign policy establishment struggles to give meaning, purpose, and direction to America's global preeminence. No consensus exists on whether the United States should guarantee the multilateral order, lead coalitions of like-minded states against non-aligned countries, or seek to extract better terms from bilateral interactions driven by narrowly defined national interests. Such tribulations, reflected in at times wild foreign policy oscillations, have dented America's standing and capacity to organize international consensus. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
It's not just us lot. The US seems to have lost all respect even for its closest allies and cousins, the Europeans, in undermining their interests. The JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal would have secured trade between the 28-member European bloc and Iran. But the US pulled out in 2018 and rattled the deal. In doing so, it endangered the nuclear non-proliferation process, which I mentioned earlier. Europe is right in doing all it can or thinks it can to keep the deal alive. The deal, or whatever is left of it, is what created trust between Iran and the West, as it is a means of keeping Iran's nuclear program under surveillance, in return for lifting sanctions off this country to make way for foreign trade and transactions. And the US bins the deal. But why is Iran so insistent on independence and possessing means of national defense? The answer can be traced in the West Asian country's geostrategic positioning and history. The 8-year Iraq-Iran war of the 80s and Iran's isolation is still alive in memory. But to refresh our longer-term historical memory, the French, the more amicable of the three modern European powers, formed an alliance with Iran or Persia against Russia and Great Britain between 1807 and 1809. But it soon dropped out to ally with Russia during the Russo-Persian War. Apparently, things aren't that different today, talking not by measure, but by nature.
ببینید ما داریم راه خودمون رو میریم. درسته که در این راه
We are going our own way. There are many obstacles. The US and its allies are jointly pressuring us. Some of these allies of the US apparently reject its pressure and sanctions campaign, but in practice, the Western partners of the US have done nothing to relieve pressure on our country. And under such circumstances, we are looking for actors and a way out. We have various tools at our disposal. We enjoy good international diplomacy and significant domestic production potential. We would need a group of elements that would help us get rid of the present circumstances, mainly sanctions and pressure.
Now I hope you like history, because I'm going to give you a brief but neat account. No interviews in between. Between the Russians and British, Iran, never a colony and impartial in both world wars, was strategically split for benefits. It goes back to well before the world wars, actually, to the mid-19th century. England wanted to keep Russia off India and outlets to the seas, referring to Iran's southern waters opening onto the Indian Ocean, and Iran became dueling grounds for the two. No constructive work could be undertaken in this country except upon the initiative of Russian banks in the north or of the British in the south. Persian liberals or nationalists got to establish a constitutional monarchy, and a first parliament or majlis was convened in 1906. But Iran was put in the debt of the Brits and Russians, the two powers that planned to take over control of this country for exploitation, but under the guise of stabilizing its finances. Until the outbreak of the First World War, Persia was held in pawn by the two powers. Domineering and interference went on right up to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. In 1951, Britain made a grave mistake by making an oil royalty issue a matter of national pride for Iranians. In the same way, the current nuclear dispute with America could turn into an object of Iranian national pride once again. The US can still cut its losses, but we learn from history that we learn nothing from history, and the US has had a really short history to learn from. So if it doesn't want its hegemony and New World Order busted, I'm not sure if it can help itself by any means above the military, be it an economic war or one of arms. I asked regarding today, how do you evaluate Iran's standing as a state in contempt of the US world order?
I see a bright future for our country. I place hope in the future. Today our people are not feeling quite well, as they are under tough economic pressure. We owe them, but I hope in the future, because we have millions of revolutionary specialized youth in this country who can be effective in the future. Instead of resorting to East or West, we must rely on our own youth, elites, and human resources. They are more valuable than our oil. If we rely on them, our future will be bright, and I am optimistic about the future.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do watch again at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's on. And don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.